That's always kind of a difficult part of all these online meeting these days, right? And so without further ado, let me jump right in. Again, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to all of you today. This is one of my very first webinars, and the first one absolutely for the Atlantic Planners Institute. So thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. And I'm hoping to perhaps stimulate and promote some new and interesting and strange ideas today. So I'm going to keep it fairly broad. But I'm going to try and focus a little bit on my research that I'm doing during my PhD at UBC and bring in some of the work that I've done actually in Halifax as well. And so just as a brief overview, I'm a former urban forester. I worked for the city of Montreal for about a year and a half after completing my master's. I generally am interested in anything to do with cities. I like to think of myself as a cities scientist. I also like to think of myself as a pracademic, so a practical academic, but does that really exist? We'll see. And I'm currently in my second year of my PhD at UBC in urban forestry. And it's a wonderful place to study urban forestry because we actually have one, or really the only urban forestry program in Canada. And it's quite new, but it shows where the field is going, which is super exciting. I also want to acknowledge that we're living in strange and difficult times right now. I'm located in Ottawa right now. I'm working remotely, and I don't know what the situation is like in Halifax, but it seems like everything has calmed down quite a bit. But I think that in the last few months, there has been a recognition that parks and green spaces are incredibly important, both to physical and mental health. And in a time of COVID or pandemics, there's been this surge in need and in demand for these green spaces, especially equitable access to these green spaces as escapes from our confinement. And so I think that hopefully the work that I do and that we all do is proving to be incredibly important in these times and will likely, be brought to the forefront of sustainability, not only from an environmental perspective, but also from a cultural and a social perspective. So as much as these times have been difficult, I think that there's really some exciting opportunity here to enact some really important change and to make sure that parks, green spaces, and effective urban planning really stay at the forefront of how our cities should kind of be managed in the future. So my focus primarily during my PhD is on urban forests. And I actually started my career in urban forestry in Halifax when I started my master's degree. I'm sure many of you recognize Point Pleasant Park and the incredible elm trees that thankfully are still standing in Halifax, as well as some basswood or linden trees. I was not actually entirely aware of the field of urban forestry before I started my master's. And I'm not entirely sure how much urban forest and green infrastructure figure in your work as planners in the Atlantic region, but it's a field that is absolutely growing and evolving, and it really comes from this recognition that nature and urban nature provide many restorative and psychological and physical benefits and ecosystem services that our cities need. There is often a lack of these services. Cities often take ecosystem services outside of the boundaries of cities. And there is this recognition that we need to produce these services within the city boundaries ourselves. And trees are a very important component of that. And to broaden that even further, when we talk about green infrastructure and the way that we conceptualize green infrastructure at UBC, trees are one component of that. And so green infrastructure, a term that kind of emerged in the early 1990s, really, refers to any kind of natural or semi-natural components in cities that provide multifunctional benefits. Often we also call them co-benefits. So the idea that one kind of type or structure of green infrastructure can provide many different social, ecological, or economic benefits. Often they're adaptive. They can take on many forms and produce benefits at many scales, and they're often thought of as sustainable. From an asset management perspective, there is a lot of really interesting novel work being done on green infrastructure and the appreciation of these assets over time. compared to traditional gray infrastructure, and how there may actually be cost reductions in the long run as we integrate green infrastructure more and more into traditional asset management schemes, which is quite interesting. And this is just a figure from a Metro Vancouver primer on green infrastructure. And as it shows, green infrastructure can take on many different forms and produce benefits for city dwellers at many different scales as well. And urban forests are a component of green infrastructure. They are not the only component. But what's fascinating about urban forests, at least, is that they really do provide this vertical structure in the form of trees that is hard to replicate otherwise. And so for most of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on urban forests, but of course, many of the kind of concepts and ideas that I'll be presenting can be applied to green infrastructure more broadly. So as planners, I'm also sure that you've heard the term smart cities, and this is another component of my research that is proving to be really interesting and emerging as a concept, particularly in Canada since 2017, when Infrastructure Canada launched a challenge for cities to create these ideas or these proposals about how to integrate data and connected and digital technologies into urban life to be able to improve the quality of life for citizens. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that Montreal, my hometown, won one of the big challenges associated with that. And so it's definitely become a more common term in the public sphere ever since Infrastructure Canada launched that. And it's definitely a discipline that is being talked about a lot more in the last few years, especially given the ubiquity of mobile and digital technology in our everyday lives. And so the way that I've kind of tried to start conceptualizing smart cities in my own work, and the way that many other scholars do, is to look at it in this dual theme. The first theme being that the data and information that's collected through these connected technological means can be harnessed and used in such a way as to inform planning, inform management, and be able to more efficiently provide services to citizens. And so when I think of this kind of theme in smart cities, I often think about the cloud, right? It's a little bit more top down, and it's kind of high up, and it's a little bit of a black box too sometimes. But it's really the idea that we use data, we use kind of more innovative information technologies and data analysis techniques to enable the delivery of municipal services. Another way that we can also look at smart cities is from the social angle or the people angle, where investments in social capital can also result in higher quality of life for citizens. And we can use technology to allow for investments in social capital as well. And when we think about connected technology in particular, there are a lot of opportunities to promote kind of more grassroots organizations and initiatives. And so when I think about that kind of side of smart cities, I think about the smartphone, which itself has been used to kind of provide really efficient means for communication and connection throughout the city. And so these kind of two dual themes in smart cities, I find quite easy to kind of conceptualize where we might be going at this interface and kind of within this new paradigm potentially of city planning. So in this presentation today, I thought that I would maybe go over just three really broad themes or broad patterns or trends in the smart cities discourse and how they relate to green infrastructure and urban forest management. The first being artificial intelligence, again, a very ubiquitous term, often used interchangeably with machine learning. They're not quite the same thing. I'm not going to be going into too many technical aspects here. I really want to keep this broad and a little bit more engaging. And so that's kind of one particular theme in smart cities. The second being Internet of Things, the idea that we can extend the virtual environment to a range of objects and processes. And finally, open data, which does have a lot of potential in urban forestry and green infrastructure management, and has actually already been used in urban forest inventorying. So I'll get into that in a bit. So these are the three kind of themes or applications I thought would be really interesting to talk about, and I thought would be probably most relevant to your work, and hopefully beyond the kind of green infrastructure and urban forest discourse, there may be some discussion at the end of presentation about how it may be applied more specifically to what you do in your locale. So the broad question that I am really looking to answer in my PhD is, are the smart cities people? So that often includes kind of software developers, civil engineers, tech evangelists, and everyone else kind of working at this interface of data and digital tech. Are they talking to the green infrastructure people? Are they talking to the urban foresters? Are they talking to landscape planners? Are they talking to the people who are in charge of managing these systems that provide so many important and often irreplaceable benefits to citizens? And the reason why I ask this question is because both of these worlds are gaining incredible traction these days. And this is just a really quick analysis on an academic database here, showing that the topic of green infrastructure has become incredibly popular in the last even 5 to 10 years. And so has the topic of smart cities. So clearly these trends are occurring concurrently, but what's interesting is that they don't necessarily seem to be occurring in tandem or connected to each other. So when you look at the number of publications here in each topic, and when you look at the number of publications where they overlap, there are very few. And that to me signals a gap in this work where we need to start talking to people who are not necessarily within kind of our discipline, our paradigm, our worldview, but clearly both of these huge fields are becoming increasingly popular and likely going to be becoming more prevalent in urban life. And so how can we find ways to perhaps connect them better, and what are the opportunities there? So that really provides kind of the foundation for my work. And I think that there are likely going to be huge evolutions at the intersection of both of these broad fields. So again, going back to these three themes or three kind of applications, how might they specifically relate to urban forestry and green infrastructure management? The first being artificial intelligence, and I've kind of put a really broad kind of layperson definition here. So the simulation of human intelligence processes by computer systems, by digital systems, in order to perform tasks normally requiring human intelligence. So again, I won't go too much into the technical side of things, but I do want to talk about some of the applications of AI and machine learning in green infrastructure management. One of the most popular being an index that was developed by MIT that used machine learning to autonomously or automatically calculate a green index based on Google Street View images. And so this is quite interesting to me because as a forester, I mean, I would look at Google Street View images all the time to look at the particular trees that citizens were complaining about and actually look at them over time to see how they might change. And so there are really fascinating opportunities here to be able to automate systems in which we might monitor our assets, our natural assets such as trees, in a more kind of automatic way, in a more autonomous way, and perhaps even get at these really interesting indices or tree health indicators based on these computer vision techniques. And so one can imagine that being able to do this, across cities and even across wider landscapes, across regions and nations could provide really interesting data on how green our cities are and could provide or inform management plans, not only urban forest management plans, but also sustainable development and climate change plans. And especially if this data could be updated at much faster rates than we are able to go out and inventory our trees and check up on condition. and all that kind of stuff, which is a huge challenge in urban forestry today. So this is one really interesting application, and I think that the project is called Treepedia, and it's available online in case you're interested in reading more about it. I think it's a kind of a web-based platform that you can play around with, and I chose the city of Montreal, my hometown, to take a look at what the Green View Index was. So lately, scholars and researchers and practitioners are applying machine learning in different ways in urban forestry. So one master's student at UBC that I worked a little bit with looked at mapping trees, so automating tree inventories using street level imagery and machine learning. So the idea that you're able to use Google Street View imagery, which is available on your computer, and be able to actually inventory the trees based on that, which would of course save a lot of labor and money compared to how we inventory trees today, which is often very time consuming, very labor intensive, and very costly. So the idea that a computer could do that for you is quite an interesting prospect. Of course, comes with a lot of challenges as well. And I actually just attended a webinar a few weeks ago where Davy Tree, which is a tree care company, has partnered with, I believe, a Dutch company to collect their own data on natural assets such as trees, where, like the Google car, this car goes around, it has a LiDAR scanner, it has, I believe, optical sensors, and it's able to use machine learning to identify certain features or characteristics in the urban landscape, which could then inform not only tree inventories, but urban forest planning, green infrastructure planning, and be able to update at rates that we're not quite able to do without these technologies. And so again, there's this potential interesting evolution in urban forest inventorying and management where we might have data at our disposal at more rapid intervals than we haven't been able to have before, which is pretty exciting, especially given the fact that in urban forestry, we are quite worried about the challenges that are coming our way, including climate change and pests and other urban stressors. And being able to engage in more preventative or proactive management and care compared to reactive is going to be very crucial when it comes to effective urban forest planning. So the second theme, the Internet of Things, the idea of kind of ubiquitous connection between objects in the environment. And one really simple example of this is a smart home. So the idea that you have kind of a Google Nest or a little thing on your door that sees when you're coming home, and being able to adjust lights from your smartphone. So things like that. That's kind of, that is what would consist the Internet of Things. So what does it mean to potentially apply this concept to trees and green infrastructure? And so when we think of the Internet of Things, we often think of just kind of this ubiquitous connection between different components in the urban environment. This may be grids, cameras, traffic lights, lighting in buildings, etc. And so one kind of concrete and smaller scale example of this, and you may have heard about this, but it's this kind of smart tree developed in Europe a few years ago, which uses these types of sensors, these Internet of Things sensors, to monitor certain environmental parameters in the soil, in this little bench here, and in the air, and be able to track how this kind of moss-like green infrastructure bench might mitigate air pollution in doing so. And so it's really this monitoring system that's able to see how this smart tree is contributing to the environment through mitigative and adaptive means. So this is kind of one smaller scale example. Another example is this really interesting project in the Harvard Forest near Boston, where sensors have been attached to this tree. They call it the witness tree. And kind of like the previous example, they track all kinds of environmental parameters. And then what's cool is that they've built a computer program that actually translates what the sensors are tracking in the environment and in the tree itself to messages for Facebook and Twitter. And so there's actually a link at the bottom there. If you follow this tree on social media, you will kind of get some really interesting information on what that tree is feeling or doing or sensing on that particular day, which is quite interesting, right? You're almost creating this kind of autonomous social media tree, which has implications itself, but it just shows that there are some really fascinating management opportunities here, and also just data opportunities. Think about how much data is being collected around this particular tree at any given time, and how might that inform kind of wider management strategies for the Harvard forest. And so, like I said, one can imagine that if we have some sensors kind of hooked up to these trees, almost like these tree like Fitbits or Apple Watches, we may be able to get at the language of trees. We may be able to get at you know, tree needs, whether that's watering, pollution issues, soil compaction, and perhaps engage in more proactive management strategies, which we have a very hard time doing sometimes in urban forestry, especially when we're dealing with either aging trees, trees that are subject to particular environmental stressors, whether that's climate related or urban related. And there are some also interesting implications for just understanding trees better. And like I said, getting at the language of trees that we may not have been able to get at before, which is a bit more of kind of an abstract idea, but there are some concrete real opportunities here that are being explored, and actually at UBC as well. I'm involved in a project around that too. So finally, a kind of third theme around kind of smart tech and digital technologies and smart cities is open data, which is really gaining some recognition as an interesting tool that can connect citizens to the government and governance structures that they're kind of a part of in the city. So this is the idea that data, especially in the context of governmental data, is open and can be freely downloaded, used, modified, and shared by anyone for any particular purpose. And so one great example of this is actually happening at the city of Edmonton, where they have made their tree inventory completely open, and citizens are able to participate in that tree inventory by actually mapping and pinpointing where certain trees are in the city. And there's a mobile application format, so you can be on a jog, taking a walk, and you can contribute to this inventory. And an additional fun feature of this inventory is that you can actually submit pictures and stories of trees. And I was just on the platform a while ago, and one example of this is that citizens were submitting pictures of trees that they had received as part of some Arbor Day initiative back in grade school. And they were showing pictures of these trees kind of 10, 20, and even 30 years down the line. And so there's this interesting kind of cultural and social implication here, where you can connect not only with people, but also with the trees in your city through this platform, which has been shown to be quite important for stewardship purposes and for environmental management purposes. To be able to connect citizens to their landscape, to their trees, to their assets, can often be quite powerful when it comes to effective environmental management. And technology such as this, and it's not a very sophisticated technology either, but it can really serve as this important medium for connecting people to people and people to trees. Another example of this was work done by one of my colleagues, James Steenberg, who actually works for the Nova Scotia Department of Lands and Forestry right now. But during his, or right after his PhD, he did some interesting work on 311 calls in Toronto, which was publicly available. And they were looking at kind of tree-related 311 calls and where they occurred throughout the city, and what that might tell us about management priorities and implications for urban forest managers. Again, getting at this idea of more proactive management, being able to anticipate potential problems, potential needs, and try and more effectively manage our natural assets in this way. And there was also some work that was done on building permit open data, and how building permits might correlate with tree losses or tree gains throughout the city. And so this is a great example of using open data to get at relationships that we may not have been able to get at otherwise without this open data. It really provides a venue for citizens, for academics, for anyone really who's interested to look at different relationships throughout the city and be able to get at how these relationships can help us manage the city better, depending on needs. And this is something that's really important in urban forestry, because there is this recognition that urban forests are really social and ecological systems. It's not often just about the tree, it's about the people around the tree and what they value and how they interact with that resource and how that resource benefits or disadvantages them in certain ways. And so it's quite important when we're talking about urban forests to really get at that social angle, which is why this is such an interesting project and why it's a precursor, I think, to a lot of other really interesting relationships that we may be able to glean from open data. And so this is a paper that I helped contribute to, that James also wrote, which is a paper about how we might be able to envision ecosystem management in cities for urban forests. And there is a heavier focus in this new conceptualization on data and information management, and also on partnerships and civic engagement, which often go hand in hand. So this idea that people more and more are going to be contributing and making their mark on the urban landscape, and often that could occur through this kind of technological mediator, and through kind of understanding these new relationships that we haven't previously examined before. So related, one of the big questions that I would like to try and address during my PhD is, what is the future of urban forestry and green infrastructure management, especially given the trends and patterns that we're seeing in urban planning related to ubiquitous technology and computing and the increasing integration of digital technologies into the urban fabric. And so this is one article that we published, kind of trying to examine potential patterns at the intersection of urban forestry and smart cities. And often what we're seeing relevant to those two themes that I talked about the smartphone and the cloud, is that smart technologies can be used both to improve stakeholder engagement and citizen participation in urban forest planning, which could be, of course, extended to green infrastructure planning and perhaps other elements of urban planning. And there's also this theme of smart technologies being able to improve or mediate the delivery of benefits that trees provide. And so these two themes often interact with each other, especially, let's say, in the case of mobile and citizen science, but it's helpful to kind of separate them out to get at really how technology is playing a role in this social and ecological system, to not only connect people with trees, but in some ways also to connect trees to us and to help us understand perhaps what is needed from a management perspective. And another theme that is emerging from this discourse as well is this integration of green and gray infrastructure. So the idea that green infrastructure could be used to enhance gray infrastructure systems and vice versa. And so this is probably best exemplified by these amazing renderings of buildings that we often see. And there's one in Milan called the Bosco Verticale. And this idea that we can integrate both of these kind of systems perhaps in a self-sustaining way, depending on kind of the technology that's at our disposal and depending on our needs and priorities, of course. But there's something quite interesting about these images that highlight that, you know, perhaps technology can act as a way to integrate green infrastructure systems to be able to leverage the benefits of both, and try and kind of minimize the costs associated with both too. which I think is potentially really exciting future avenue in urban forestry and in green infrastructure management, because there is no doubt that people in cities are asking for, exposure to green space in healthy and safe ways, and this may be an opportunity to do so. Now, of course, there are also challenges related to the growing intersection of green infrastructure and smart and digital technology management, one of which is equity. That's a theme that we also grapple with in urban forestry. Do people have equitable access to green space? And if you do have access to green space, does everyone have access to the same quality of green space? And that's a growing theme in urban forestry that's becoming, incredibly interesting and nuanced, and it relates to themes of green gentrification as well. And so if you kind of add on the layer of this digital component, we also see inequities arise when it comes to access to the digital and virtual world as well. And this is exemplified in this one particular example of just smartphone use and access. So we see that compared to the rest of the world, Canada is pretty up there when it comes to smartphone use. But even within Canada, we can see disparities associated with internet use, internet access, broadband access, and smartphone use as well. And those differences are particularly prevalent when it comes to comparing, the southern parts of Canada compared to the more northern parts and the more remote and rural areas of Canada, which, is potentially problematic when it comes to the delivery of municipal services. Will some municipalities end up way ahead compared to others because of access to internet and digital resources, which can be absolutely problematic. The fact that we may end up enhancing kind of the haves compared to the have-nots is a problem. Not only that, but many people are concerned about how plugged in we are, especially these days. There are articles about Zoom fatigue and how our brain has not evolved to be this plugged in, having our screens in front of us all the time, and what this means also for long-term brain development. And so does the increasing integration of, digital infrastructure into urban life, and especially for the purpose of managing green infrastructure systems, are we perhaps contributing to this phenomenon? And is that a good thing? And that I'm not sure really what the answer is to that. It perhaps remains to be seen, but it can somewhat relate to this concept of environmental amnesia, which is the idea that each generation perceives the environment into which it's born compared to the previous one, no matter how different it's become. And some scholars are really worried about this because we are, dealing with a lot of environmental issues related to biodiversity collapse and climate change. And so is each generation going to be adapted essentially to the new normal? And what does that mean for long-term sustainability? One can perhaps, say the same thing about the digital integration into the environment. So as we move forward and as digital technologies are used more and more for environmental and green infrastructure management, will a similar type of environmental generational amnesia take place where each generation is used to the kind of digital infrastructure integration? And does that mean that as humans, we're moving further and further away from nature? And what does that mean for us as humans? And what does that mean for perhaps the new nature that we're creating with these technologies? These are some really interesting, more philosophical questions that I think are worth thinking about as we develop new tools and as we use new technologies for more effective monitoring and management. So given all this, one field that's really been fascinating me is the field of forecasting. So this idea that we can try and predict the future or lay out roadmaps and scenario planning for what we should expect and perhaps what we should work towards in our respective fields. And so some of our team have kind of engaged in these little exercises. And so sometimes I like to think about, picturing a city like Vancouver here, where I'm currently based for my PhD, and thinking to myself, okay, given all the patterns and the trends that we're seeing taking place in cities and at the intersection of, smart technologies and urban forestry, what might be expected? What should we perhaps start planning for? And how can we kind of negotiate planning for the future, but also trying to shape the future itself? And so sometimes what I like to do is I like to come up with these kind of ideas for what we might see at the intersection of digital infrastructure and urban forestry, and predict what might be coming down the line in 5 to 10 years. And so, for example, we might start seeing more social media images tracked for citizen perspectives on trees, and that may inform planting decisions. Maybe people prefer cherries in Vancouver over red maples. That's entirely possible. And how will urban forest managers and landscape planners use information potentially from widely available social media images to actually inform city planning? Another example could also be maybe the use of open data and artificial intelligence to better map mycorrhizae in tree roots and in urban soils to try and mitigate young tree losses when they're first planted in cities. Other ideas, kind of like what I just mentioned, are tree Fitbits or tree Apple Watches or whatever you use to monitor environmental parameters in real time. And you can imagine that combined with moisture sensors that perhaps even connect to citizen cell phones, we may be able to get at kind of more integrated governance and management strategies for making sure that trees do survive through harsher urban environments. Actually, something that was developed, I think, in China a few years ago is this tree climbing robot. So the idea that we may have areas in a city that are harder to get at when you're an arborist. And I'm thinking like, Point Pleasant Park post Hurricane Juan would have been a prime example. So how can we perhaps use these technologies to get at harder to get spaces and be able to ensure safety in our workforce as well? Perhaps another idea is to use satellite imagery and artificial intelligence to better get at pest risks. We're dealing with emerald ash borer, Dutch elm disease. How can we perhaps use remote sensing techniques in a more automated or autonomous way to get at risks and threats to the urban forests and be able to engage in more proactive management based on that? Other potential examples are, augmented reality games to engage citizens in taking care of newly planted trees, which often deal with a lot of issues in urban environments. And they're often very difficult to, in terms of mortality and rates, to get at kind of that maturity level where ecosystem services are really truly felt in the urban forest. And so augmented reality or virtual reality might be the perfect way to gamify citizen engagement in urban forest management. So these are just kind of a few ideas that myself and a couple of team members have brainstormed together based on patterns and trends that have emerged from the literature and from talking to practitioners. So it can be really interesting on your own end to kind of engage in these potential forecasting techniques and scenario generation based on the patterns and trends that you're seeing occur in your own context, in your own city. So in terms of future research needs, I guess I'll just end off with this, and then I'm happy to take questions and kind of engage in more in-depth discussion. At the intersection of kind of digital tech and urban forestry, there are a few kind of emerging things that have come up here, and of course there are many more, but these are the ones that I felt are kind of interesting to talk about. And the first one's around data. So given the huge quantity of data that is collected through various means in the city, which ones are really meaningful and valuable for urban forestry and for green infrastructure management? And how can open data be used to improve decision making, improve citizen stewardship and participation, and also inform policy making? The second is this idea of kind of ecosystem sustainability and organization. So can technology actually help us kind of create these hybrid and perhaps self-sustaining ecosystems and allow for more proactive management, where we're having such a hard time kind of getting at, you know, what are the emerging threats, when are they going to come up, and how can we effectively manage for them without losing out on a bunch of, whether it's trees, plants, other types of green infrastructure. How can we ensure that we can retain those benefits? And one big problem, of course, around all this is cost and barriers. So how much would this all cost, right? How can we, you know, often when budgets, especially for urban forestry and green infrastructure, are often very tight, how can we start innovating? How can we start trialing out these new technologies when there's often so much risk involved? Does that involve potentially like public-private partnerships or other financing schemes? What does that look like? Which I think is a huge question mark, but also a huge opportunity in this discourse. And related, you know, what are the barriers to uptake of this stuff? Do we want to be, you know, throwing out all this kind of technological innovation in urban nature and seeing what sticks? You know, what is strategic, what makes sense, and how might that depend on the local context as well? And related to that, and this has been in the news, of course, in the last couple of years as well, with, you know, Sidewalk Toronto, which was a smart city project in Toronto led by Google. How can we ensure that as we kind of integrate technology into the urban fabric, we still ensure that citizens have a reasonable amount of privacy and there is security there? And how can we ensure that the integration of this infrastructure is equitable, not only from a technological perspective, but also a green space perspective? Oh, so I'm going to end on that note. It's been wonderful to kind of run through some of these ideas with you, and hopefully we'll engage in some interesting discussion after this. And if ever you're interested in chatting more about it, my email is right at the bottom there, and I would love to hear from you. So thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and looking forward to discussion and questions.
Thank you so much, Sophie. We've got about 20 people on. That's great. And so I'm going to open up the floor for questions. I think if you want to ask a question, how about you turn your mic on? I'll see the green and call on you so we don't have 8 people jumping at once. Want to give that a try? Okay, so George, you're up.
Hey, my name is George Pashitsky. I'm a retired engineer in Wolfville, and I joined the climate circles in January, and I joined the tree group, a subgroup of the climate circles. So I had a couple questions for you. How do you deal with people that are technologically adverse to higher end technology? I had a group that it was retired engineers, retired teachers, still working, practicing teachers. And when COVID hit us, we really had to get off of our private meetings and go on to Facebook, which nobody wanted to go on. And then we went to Zoom, which nobody wanted to talk on. And then they just said, well, call us when COVID's over. And I'm going like, wow, you know, I had the retired engineer told me that like modeling like iTree doesn't work. And I'm going like, wow, I mean, I got this, you know, well-educated technological group, and as soon as we got off the email and the phone calls, they just disappeared. And hence,
yeah, that's a huge challenge. I agree, and as a millennial, I've definitely had different experiences with technology compared to older generations, and also compared to younger ones. So I will also likely be reticent to new emerging stuff in 20, 30 years compared to younger generations. I don't think that that's necessarily anything new. I will say, though, I think that there is something to be said for the value proposition, the value that you are attributing to the kind of cost or learning curve that it takes to adopt a technology. And it can be very hard sometimes to see that value when the cost is staring at you right in the face. But I think that as a student who is in a field that is quite new and developing, the best lesson, and it's not an easy answer, but the best lesson I've kind of taken so far is to be able to really construct the story or the narrative around what you're trying to sell. Because sometimes it is just about selling something, whether it's an idea or a product, a new technology, whatever, is being able to construct the story and to show people how using that will provide value to their lives. And the reality is that you won't convince everyone, but I have found that to be like a really useful way to convey new information. And I think that also relates to technology adoption. That being said, though, there's a lot of research on technology adoption theory and how to get people on the innovation curve that I'd be happy to share with you that I've kind of read about. I'm no expert by any means, but there is kind of some behavioral and marketing psychology stuff there that might be helpful for you in your work. So I can send that to you.
Yes, I would appreciate that. I'll email
Sure.
you. Can I
No
have
problem.
a question? Can I do another question?
Sure. Oh yeah, I'm saying sure, yeah. Go ahead.
You say citizens identifying trees. Now, we opened up the iTree program and we had a coordinator in Wolfville, and when she hit the drop down for what kind of tree is it, she was hit with like dozens or hundreds of these long tree names that you really have an arborist to really get through. And
Yeah.
so, you know, if you have people going around saying, well, I think this is a sugar maple or a Norway maple or this or that, how do you validate that they actually know what tree it is?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I will say that we're still struggling with that for sure, especially when it comes to citizen-based inventories. I do though know that New York had a very successful run at this as part of their Million Trees campaign a few years ago. And I will say that the probably the best solution to all of this is actually technology. There are some really interesting apps that are coming out these days, like one of them is Leaf Snap, which are not so great now, but I would wager that in a few years, because the technology is based on lots of contributions from users, where users will actually take a picture and kind of more professional ones or proficient ones will be able to identify it, then using machine learning and artificial technology techniques, these apps and these kind of algorithms can do the work for you. And so although there are challenges now associated with kind of our older, more traditional systems, I will wager that in the pretty near future, we're going to have quite sophisticated applications and software that will be able to do the work for you. And I think that will be a game changer in citizen science and in environmental management when these algorithms become sophisticated enough to be able to help you not only kind of wherever you are in the world, but actually in your own city. You know, being able to tell you, you know, you're in this climate region right now, it's more likely than not that it's going to be sugar maple compared to big leaf maple or whatever. And so, you know, I think that it's coming. It's not quite there yet, but I think technology is part of the answer to that.
Well, it'd be like a tree recognition program. I know my iPhone does a marvelous job of facial recognition.
There you go.
Into their little folder, and it sees right through sunglasses and everything. And
yeah, it's the same idea, really. There are many more trees, I suppose, that you'd really have to identify at the species level, which becomes quite challenging, and cultivars and all that kind of stuff. But it's the same idea, absolutely. And did we really think that like 10 years ago we'd be able to open our phones and it just recognize us no matter what? I think that's kind of crazy too. So you never know.
The other thing I recommended to our climate change coordinator, who may be on this meeting or not, I'm not sure. I said, well, he said, well, there's only 30 or 40 different kinds of trees in Wolfville. So I said, well, why don't we get a professional to link up those 40 to that 1,000 that spill out when you hit the drop down and go, well, okay, if you think it's a sugar maple, this is the big long name that corresponds to it. Because I know I went and looked at those long names. I go, oh my, that's that is daunting. It's,
I absolutely think it's possible. I think it's possible.
just one other comment or question. The integration of green into gray infrastructure. I was trying to get an urban forest management plan here in Wolfville, where I think we're heading that way. And one of the things I read across urban forest management plans in other cities was not just having everything within the parks and rec department, and have every department, whether it be public works or bylaws or development, each with their own tree mandate and what they do for trees, and not having the poor parks and recs guy chasing developers and construction crews and all that kind of stuff every time they move something out there.
Yeah, I mean, public works integration is still a huge challenge. I mean, I know that from experience in the city of Montreal. And again, kind of similar to the previous comment, I think that technology does potentially have a role to play in that. If we have better collaborative tools that can be used across departments, but also not only across city departments, also across kind of stakeholders and collaborators in certain projects, whether they be cloud-based or not, I think that there's a lot of potential for just more effective collaboration between different actors and stakeholders in the city.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, it looks like we have a question from Talha. You're up if that's the case.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sophie, for a great talk. It was extremely informative. I'm an urban planning student interning at Nova Scotia Environment this summer, and it's really exciting to see what's going on urban forestry wise, and especially what could happen in this area. My question is along the lines of equitable access to green space and urban forestry vegetation cover. I know you mentioned that it is currently a knowledge gap in this area, but could you elaborate a bit on how we can ensure that we're using this technology to help address inequities in access to green space and vegetation cover urban forestry? Urban governance seems to be a key factor, but just wondering what your general thoughts are on this area and how this research gap should be addressed.
That's a super interesting question. Thank you. It sounds like you're doing some really cool work as well. So yeah, urban green equity is definitely a growing field. Actually, one of my supervisors, her specialty is urban green equity. She's looking at green gentrification. I'll say where the most, at least to me, interesting prospects are in this field relate to the kind of the foundational issues related to green equity. Often what happens when people don't have equitable access to green space is that it's either kind of a historical issue in the city itself. So sometimes neighborhoods were actually planned for specific, whether it's social economic classes or racial classes, and then these neighborhoods kind of are historically disadvantaged based on then where parks were planned around. Often parks, especially kind of better quality ones, are planned in richer and often in Canada whiter neighborhoods. Often it is more wealthy neighborhoods that could actually ask the city for better maintenance of their trees. And so over time, these kind of historical equities, whether they be inequities, whether they be planning related, income and kind of power related, are exacerbated and kind of manifest over time. And so what you end up seeing is that in different places in the city, you have kind of different levels of tree or urban forest quantity and quality, depending on the spatial distribution, depending on these historical neighborhoods. And so one of the more interesting ways in which technology, and especially remote sensing, can get at these questions is really getting at the actual kind of quantification of this inequity. So there is some work being done on actually mapping urban heat across a city. So that's been done, I think, in Portland, Oregon right now, and it's going to be done in Surrey in BC, and looking at how the urban heat island effect disproportionately affects certain communities based on historical inequalities such as race and ethnic groups, but also now related to social and economic disparities as well. And so being able to use technology such as remote sensing techniques, whether it's satellite imagery or sensors around like different parts of the city, or even on cars or bikes that go through streets and actually monitor the environmental parameters, such as heat, we can get at who is disproportionately affected and what areas of the city are most affected. And then based on that, we can really be able to prioritize or figure out how to plan for better distribution of green space across the city. So I would say that like data is a huge component here, being able to really quantify what these inequities look like. It's not just a question of, oh, this person has access to that park, this person doesn't. It's about what does that lack of access mean from like a quality of life perspective. And you know, the one big example is of course the urban heat island effect. I hope that answers your question too.
Yeah, it definitely does. Thank you very much for such a thorough answer. The heat island effect perspective is definitely a new one for me and really interesting. I'm gonna follow up on that. So yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, feel free to email me too if you want to chat further about that.
For sure, thank you.
So Sophie, we're at 3 o'clock, but if you have time for one more question, I see that Jordan has his hand up digitally. So
yeah,
Jordan, you're up.
Great, thank you. Sophie, thank you for your presentation. I thought it was really interesting. My question is around the Google Sidewalk Labs that you mentioned, that project. So I understand that green infrastructure is kind of nested in the smart city movement and the smart city ideology. And it's also my understanding that Google Sidewalk Labs was going to be a flagship smart city project for Canada. And my question is, I was wondering how exactly the failure of the Sidewalk Labs project in Toronto, and I think it's being wrapped up and pulled out. Google has pulled out of that, and I just wanted to know how that failure affected how you were predicting the future of green infrastructure, given that it's nested within the smart city movement and this flagship project.
Sure, that's such a great question. It's funny, I think that project was plagued by a lot of issues. Namely, people were not impressed by how not transparent they were being when it came to like the data collection and privacy and security and all that kind of stuff. I also think that, you know, as I've never lived in Toronto, so I don't quite know what the culture is like there, but as a Canadian, I think I can also sympathize with this idea that this foreign company, you know, it's an American company coming in to your public space and basically creating something incredibly new from the ground up, not being entirely clear where the information is going and how it's being collected is a little bit troubling. Not to mention that I think that as, you know, professionals working in the urban space, we need to be very wary about the private sector moving into the public sphere and, you know, engaging in land use planning and management and creation without being fully aware of what the public consequences of that will be when it comes to, let's say, the delivery of municipal services and just generally the public good. And so I'm not entirely surprised that project kind of didn't go through in the end, because there was significant amount of backlash. And so what it means for my work, I will say, is that I think that it doesn't necessarily deter me from this work, but I think that it has made me recognize that there is a lot of potential pushback that can occur when you're not transparent and when you're not clear about how smart technologies and digital technologies are being integrated into the urban fabric. I think that was a big lesson learned, and I think that that's an important lesson because, you know, as people in a civil society, we have a right to privacy. We have a right to knowing how data being collected on us, on our trees, on whatever is being used. I will note that I was a little bit disappointed by the Sidewalk Toronto project because they didn't talk enough about green infrastructure. I think that I read through that 500-page proposal, and it was maybe on 2 pages that they talked about trees. And so I do hope that at some point, wherever they, you know, put up shop next, probably somewhere in New York or San Francisco, that they'll hopefully integrate trees a little bit more into the planning process. And maybe I can find someone over there who I can try and convince that this is just as important as putting sensors, you know, on traffic lights and on buildings. And so, but that's the big takeaway for me, is that this is all quite new, and there are a lot of potential consequences to privacy here and security, and also just generally, you know, data rights and data usage. And the public sphere, I think, is very aware of that, which is good. And that means that future smart city projects should take that into account, and there needs to be more transparent community engagement throughout, which it really didn't seem was the case in that context.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Jordan.
I'm going to put a last call out for questions. Okay, seeing none. Just one thought I have as a very unsmart city planner in terms of the kind of buzzwordy about the sidewalk lab debacle, you might call it, or failure, or thing. It's interesting how as a working planner and as very much a Jane Jacobs, Jan Gehl devotee, the idea of giving over a huge amount of very valuable space to one major player has throughout planning history often just had poor results when smart city or not. So I found it interesting that we gravitate so much to the smart city angle when it was a question of city building in general. You know, you want multiple players if you can, but that's just my moderator's 2 cents worth, because I get to throw that in. Sophie, thank you very much. So much of this was new to me. I'm very glad to say that HRM, which is Halifax, has urban forestry as front of mind. I can see it out and about. There's often a lot of work being done. Glad to hear Wolfel's looking at it and others. So very topical, and the technology side is incredibly interesting, incredibly challenging, and you did a great job talking about that. So thank you very much, and give you any last word, and then we're gonna say goodbye to everybody, I think.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Sean. And thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful. Ever since I finished up my master's in Halifax, I always just have such fond memories of doing work in urban forestry there. It's, you know, Atlantic Canada is actually a wonderful place to be doing this kind of work. And I think that there's so much kind of opportunity and potential there as well for innovation. And it just, yeah, I would love to get out to Halifax in person at some point and perhaps meet some of you. So if there are any opportunities like that, let me know, because you really do live in a wonderful, wonderful place.
We'll let COVID die down a bit more. And I mean, yeah, there's absolutely beautiful small cities and small towns all across the Maritimes. Yeah. And off the top of my head, most of them are really well treed. You know, absolutely. Just a beautiful legacy.
Yeah. So thanks again. And if you have any more questions for me, or you want to continue the dialogue, just shoot me an email.
Perfect. If anyone needs Sophie's contact and can't find it, feel free to email me. We'll get you in touch with her. So thank you again. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.